We come to you today on what may well be the most dangerous day of the crisis, maybe even one of the most consequential days. Because last night, the President of the United States, Donald Trump, took to social media, and what he said should worry the entire world. In an abuse-filled post, he threatened to bomb Iranian power plants and bridges, civilian infrastructure. Now think about that for a moment. If Iran were to attack the Brooklyn Bridge, it would be called terrorism. But when the US threatens to strike civilian targets, we are told that this is strategy. This is not strategy. This is escalation. And it is escalation of the most dangerous kind. Because once you start talking about civilian infrastructure, you are crossing a line. A legal line, a moral line, a strategic line. And once crossed, that line is very hard to come back from. Iran has already responded. It has warned of retaliation, not just military targets, but every energy infrastructure across the Gulf, across Israel. So what are we looking at now? Is it not just a war? It is a widening circle of risk. And that circle now includes civilians, economies, and entire societies. At the same time, the American president has set a deadline for a deal, a deadline for reopening the Strait of Hormuz. Deadlines in war are dangerous because when they are not met, they force action. And that action is almost always escalation. Now add to this the events of the last few days. 2 American fighter jets shot down, a rescue operation launched inside Iran, details still unclear, and we're not sure what actually happened. But what we do know is that more aircraft may have been lost. And yet, the president has declared it a great success. This is where the picture becomes clearer. There is a narrative, and then there is reality. And the two are moving further apart. Now step back, look at the global picture. Because something else is happening quietly but very clearly. The US is being left out of a lot of things. Europe is talking to Iran, holding its own meetings, exploring its own pathways, and slowly, very slowly, moving away from Washington. For a country used to leading alliances, this is unfamiliar territory, and it shows. Now look at the incentives, because every player in this conflict is calculating. The US needs a deal. Its economy is under pressure. This war is costing it billions of dollars every single day. Billions. Put that into perspective. Pakistan negotiates for months for a few $1 billion from the IMF. And here we have a war burning through that amount every few days. At the same time, there are signs of something deeper. Oil transactions increasingly being discussed in currencies other than the dollar. That is not just economics, this is geopolitics. And now look at Israel, rogue Israel, under pressure. Cities like Tel Aviv and Haifa taking hits, economic activity disrupted, people leaving. But Israel says it can't afford a stronger Iran. For them, this is existential for Iran. So they want Iran weakened, not managed, not contained, weakened, which is absolutely wrong. But which also means that the incentive is not ceasefire. The incentive is continuation. Now come to the Gulf. The GCC countries, they have paid a heavy price. They've provided space, air corridors to the US, and in return, they have taken hits, economic, strategic, reputational. Places like Dubai and Doha, built on stability, now facing uncertainty. And that changes calculations, quietly but significantly. And now Iran, a country under sustained attack by the most powerful military machine in history, and yet it has stood its ground. It has struck back. Air bases, radars, fuel infrastructure, assets that cost billions, and then the most consequential move of them all, the Strait of Hormuz closed. And with that, the world economy brought to a standstill, supply chains disrupted, fuel shortages, rationing in multiple countries, fuel running low, markets reacting. This is leverage, real leverage. And it has forced the world to pay attention. Now, Ask yourself a simple question. Why would Iran rush into a deal when it has the upper hand in pressure? When it has seen arguments and agreements which have been broken before? When it is being attacked even as talks are discussed? From Tehran's point of view, time may not be the enemy, time may be the strategy. And yet, here's where we come to the important point. This is precisely the moment where Iran needs to think carefully. Because having the upper hand does not always mean holding on to it for too long. In fact, history tells us the best time to negotiate is when you are strong, not when you are weak. Right now, today, Iran has leverage, economic leverage, strategic leverage, global leverage. It has shown it can absorb pressure and impose costs. But that leverage is also an opportunity to shape the outcome, to lock in the gains, to define the terms of engagement. The longer this continues, the higher the risk of miscalculation. And miscalculation in a conflict like this can undo everything. That is why all sides need to look seriously at diplomacy. And this is where Pakistan's initiative becomes critical. Because what Pakistan is offering, it's not just mediation, it is a starting point, a structured path to begin ending this conflict. A ceasefire, talks, protection of civilians, reopening of vital trade routes. These are not abstract ideas. These are immediate necessities. And at this moment, this may be the best chance available. Not a perfect solution, but a realistic one. And in war, realistic options are often the most valuable ones, which is why the need for diplomacy is greater than ever. Pakistan has already initiated that process, and now with growing global support, that effort is gaining structure. So we have two tracks: escalation and diplomacy. One deepens the conflict, the other seeks to resolve it. And right now the balance between those two is becoming more critical by the day. So as we move closer to the deadline set by the US President, the question is simple. Will there be a deal or will there be more escalation? Because one leads to relief, the other to something far more dangerous. And that is why one of the most consequential days of this conflict. To discuss all this, we are joined today by Mr. Ali Faiz. He is the Iran Project Director at the International Crisis Group, widely recognized for his deep understanding of Iran's politics and foreign policy. He specializes in nuclear diplomacy, US-Iran relations, and Middle East security. He also played a key role in analyzing the Iran nuclear deal and continues to provide insight on the risks of conflict and prospects for diplomacy in the region, which we are going to talk about today. Mr. Faiz, also in a recent opinion piece which was published in the New York Times, he argued that despite tactical military gains, the American president had lost control of events in a war with Iran. He also noted that while American and Israeli forces may have significantly weakened Iran's military capabilities, they have failed to achieve a decisive political outcome. According to him, Iran has adapted by shifting the battlefield, disrupting the Strait of Hormuz, continuing missile and drone attacks, and increasing the global economic cost of the conflict. He warns that military pressure alone is unlikely to force submission and may instead prolong the war. He joins us today to talk about this and other issues. Mr. Ali Faiz, welcome.
Great pleasure to be with you.
So, we're talking today at a very crucial juncture because we are a few hours before the deadline by President Trump finishes, and he's in that profanity-laden post. He had threatened all kinds of action which basically fall under the definition of war crimes. And at the same time, there is now, since the last many hours, chatter about some sort of a diplomatic breakthrough or a ceasefire. So I want to start by asking you, if these negotiations move forward, what is it that Iran could actually agree on at this stage?
Well, it's easier to answer that question by telling you what is unlikely to agree to, and what Iran is very likely to reject is any kind of ceasefire. It does want a comprehensive end to the conflict, not a ceasefire, because remember that in 2025, after the 12-day war that Israel launched against Iran and the U.S. briefly joined, Iran agreed to a unilateral ceasefire with terms imposed by President Trump on all sides, only to be the subject of another aggression 8 months later. And therefore, it doesn't want to accept a ceasefire, which it sees primarily as an opportunity for the US and Israel to rearm, regroup, and attack them again. Especially, I think, from the mediator's perspective, it was a mistake to use the 45-day window, which is exactly the kind of formula that the mediators put on the table in Gaza. And of course, there is a ceasefire now in place in Gaza that Israel continues to violate every single day. There was also a ceasefire with Lebanon that Israel continued to violate until this new round of conflict between Israel and Hezbollah. So this is why Iran is not interested in any kind of piecemeal solution. It wants a comprehensive end to the conflict. Now, there is also another key requirement for Iran, which is to remain in control of the traffic in the Strait of Hormuz. This is not about dominance from their perspective. It is about the only reliable source of revenue for the post-war period so that they can do reconstruction. They don't believe that the US would grant them sanctions relief. They are very cynical about the prospect of negotiations with the Trump administration, given the history that Trump withdrew from a negotiated deal with Iran in 2018 and then bombed them twice in the middle of negotiations last year and this year. And that's why they want to be able to continue to collect toll from vessels that transit through the Strait of Hormuz. They don't see it necessarily in a zero-sum fashion. They believe that the GCC can do the same thing and Oman could represent them. They've started some talks with the Omanis about a new regime in the Gulf, especially in the Strait, in the aftermath of the war. But I don't think any solution that would not resolve some of these key concerns for the Iranians is going to work.
But, you know, it depends, Mr. Ali Faiz, on which way you look at the situation. Last week, on this very program, I talked to Professor John Mersheimer. And then the other day, I had a conversation with Professor Robert Pape, both very well-known commentators and political scientists. And both were agreed that Iran has the upper hand now. In fact, they went as far as to say that Iran has already won the war. And also Dr. Pape, I'm sure you must have read, published an op-ed in the New York Times, exactly where you had published a couple of days back, today, where he says that Iran may become the new world power. So given the fact that it is widely understood that Iran has the upper hand, do you think there is a point where you can actually gain maximum advantage from your position of strength? And if you delay, you might miss that moment. So could this be the time where Iran would sense that they are in a good position and there could be an off-ramp, and this might be the right time for them to try and get the best possible deal?
Well, that's a very good question. And I think one of the reasons you saw the former foreign minister of Iran, Javad Zarif, publishing a piece in Foreign Affairs just 2 days ago, putting on the table a set of proposals for what kind of a deal Iran should accept, is precisely because the argument is that this is a moment that Iran has the upper hand. It has a good degree of leverage. However, it risks actually overplaying its hand, and it risks ending up in a situation that would not be as favorable to it. So now is a good time to end the war. But this is not how the Iranian decision makers seem to see things at this moment, and their calculus seems to be different. They are thinking that the amount of pain that the United States and Israel have experienced in this conflict has not yet reached an intolerable level for them. Yes, there are higher energy costs in the US. Yes, this war is not popular. Yes, there have been 13 fatalities among US troops. But you put it all together, this is still not a major embarrassment for President Trump. It has not resulted in his MAGA supporters completely turn their backs to him. So that means that Iranians might want to continue inflicting this cost so that it basically turns into a deterrent against any future conflict against them. But again, you're absolutely right that this is a very fine and delicate calculus of at what time would you think that you have gained enough leverage and you stop. And at this moment, unfortunately, I don't see that happening. The problem is Israel has already started targeting Iranian infrastructure, Iranian universities, petrochemical companies, steel factories, and Iranians are starting to retaliate in kind. And I'm afraid President Trump's frustration that he hasn't been able to prove his narrative of victory is also growing. So among all the possibilities, I think the option of further escalation seems to be the likeliest scenario at this moment, unfortunately.
I want to pick up on the escalation factor because clearly, if President Trump decides to go ahead with the threat that he's given, then we are looking at, the kind of escalation that we haven't seen in this conflict so far. But just before I go to that, you talked about this very delicate moment that Iran has, and that decision makers have to make a very calculated decision. I know that you have also been arguing or giving the example of the Iran-Iraq war, where you've also argued that in the first 2 years, Iran had an upper hand. And then the war continued for another 6 years because they wanted more advantage. So is that kicking in? Could that logic kick in? Or do you think they've learned some lessons and perhaps could take a different view this time around?
Well, I'm afraid this has turned into a pattern of Iranian behavior. They have become very good at missing opportunities. If you look at the history of nuclear news as well, they dragged out the talks with the Obama administration, really had the political will of getting a deal for far too long, and the deal had very limited time to consolidate itself before Obama left office. They missed the opportunity in the Biden administration to revive the deal. They missed the opportunity to, engage Trump in a way that would have a better chance of working with him in the way that, North Korea or Russia figured out how to deal with Trump. So there is, unfortunately, an established pattern. And the reason that Iranians are not very good at capitalizing on these moments of strength is because of the structure of the decision-making in Iran, which is this multiple power centers that always have to act in sort of counterbalancing one another or building consensus. If you had one single decision-maker, really, maybe that decision-maker could shoulder the responsibility. But that is not the case now. And everyone wants to demonstrate that they are more patriotic and stronger than their counterparts. And that's why they're often good at missing opportunities. Another reason that I'm pretty cynical about the prospects of diplomacy at this moment.
Which would be unfortunate because we know very well here in Islamabad that Pakistan's diplomacy is in overdrive. There's a lot that is happening behind the scenes that we don't know of. And there are ground for optimism but also pessimism, as you mentioned. So we are at a stage where things could go either way. But if they go south, and I say that in the context of if things don't work out and President Trump were to escalate tomorrow, where could that go?
Right. So the president has two options for escalation. One is to use ground troops, and let's remember that he has sent thousands of U.S. troops to the region. And again, the pattern of his behavior is that whenever he deploys military assets or troops, he ends up using them. He rarely just does that for show. So land invasion is one option, and it could take different forms, from occupying one or several of the islands that Iran has in the Persian Gulf, or maybe the southern shore of Iran, or it might be further inland, as a strategic location or a source of Iranian wealth, maybe an oil well or something like that. It might be a very limited sort of special force operation. It might be something with longer durations. It's really impossible to guess. But putting boots on the ground is certainly one option. Another option is what the president has threatened to do, which is to go after critical infrastructure. In both of these scenarios, the Iranians are going to respond by basically, I think, targeting U.S. naval assets in the region, targeting U.S. troops on their own territory. They might mine the Strait of Hormuz, which remains open to selective traffic, but after that, it might be actually physically closed for a while. They might even push the Houthis in Yemen to close Bab al-Mandab as well and cut off the access to the Red Sea. And that might push the price of oil to above $200 a barrel, because that is a scenario that 2/3 of Saudi and Emirati oil exports that are now passing through the Red Sea would also be blocked. And if infrastructure in Iran is attacked, Iran will do the same to the Gulf countries, to Israel. And again, that would really create a scorched earth situation throughout the region that would be disastrous for everyone.
I mean, I'm just trying to visualize if Iran, if the Americans were to target the civilian infrastructure and Iran were to retaliate by targeting similar places in the Gulf countries, that would be catastrophic, because that would just completely change the nature of this conflict.
100%, and this is why I think the most important thing that Pakistani mediation could do at this moment is to prevent that from happening, not to resolve this conflict. It is not possible, I think, at this stage, either because the parties are not ready yet, they haven't reached a point that they believe that the cost of continuation of this conflict outweighs the cost of compromise at the diplomatic table, but also because, again, the consequence of escalation will be catastrophic. I think the minimum that Pakistan could do is to at least get both sides to agree to put a ceiling on the degree of escalation. And if civilian infrastructure is taken out of the set of targets for both sides, that is already one step in the right direction, and then more steps could be built on that in a way that takes the interests of both sides into consideration. As you know, the UN has also appointed a special envoy to try to resolve this conflict, and I imagine that envoy would soon come to Iran and Pakistan and other regional countries. That would be an opportunity to try to also put maybe something related to the Strait of Hormuz on the table, allowing, for instance, food and fertilizer to pass through, with Iran and Oman on behalf of the GCC collecting transit fees. Not only this is win-win because President Trump can say he has started to open the strait, but it also recognizes a new regime in the strait after the war, in which Iran and the GCC would actually have to work together. So it's the beginning of a process of a regional cooperation on an issue of common interest, because both sides need resources to recover from this war. And so this is, I think, a much better approach than trying to get a ceasefire or trying to get a comprehensive solution to this conflict.
I think then that would be a very good positive step. Before we end today's discussion, just a final quick question. This huge big story about the American pilots being recovered from Iran. There's a lot of reporting in it today in many international and American newspapers, and a lot of discussion on it. And a lot of people, including myself, who've looked at the story very closely, find there are a lot of loopholes, a lot of things, a lot of details that have come out somehow don't make sense. Now, nobody knows what the actual story is, but when you read the story, do you also feel that 2 and 2 is not adding up to 5, to 4, and is looking like 3 or 5?
Yes, I don't think we have the full picture yet. And what is, I think, really highly questionable is why the U.S. deployed so many air assets to Isfahan. Yeah. That was probably not for the rescue mission. And if you look at the wreckage of the planes that were targeted there, now it's unclear whether the Iranians targeted it or the U.S. Destroyed its own fighter jets. It appears that there was another parallel special force operation happening, but it's unclear whether it was in support of the rescue operation or it was in pursuit of another objective. You know, as I said, I think one of the things that would allow President Trump to extricate himself from this situation is some sort of a master stroke. So if he can go and seize the stockpile of highly enriched uranium, or kidnap a senior Iranian official, or does something that would be as impressive to international media as the arrest of Maduro in Venezuela, that's the kind of thing that usually the president uses to justify taking a step back. So it is possible that something along those lines was happening, but again, at this point, we don't have enough information to be able to justify.
But whatever it was, it didn't seem to have worked out very well.
No, it was a reminder of Operation Eagle Claw in the beginning of the revolution during the hostage crisis, when President Carter sent special forces to try to rescue American hostages, and they ended up in a sandstorm, and they lost several service members and a lot of equipment, and the mission failed.
Mr. Ali Wise, thank you so much for joining us. We look forward to having you again on our show. The President of the United States has actually threatened that he will blow up power plants and bridges in Iran. This constitutes war crimes. So what are war crimes? Let me try and explain. According to the definition by the UN, war crimes are violations of international humanitarian law whose perpetrators incur individual crimes, criminal responsibility under international law. Consequently, unlike the crimes of genocide and crimes against humanity, war crimes always take place in the context of an armed conflict, whether international or not, and this is according to Article 8 of the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, of course also Geneva Conventions and the Hague Conventions. Now, what exactly are these? Let's take a look at this. There are a number of war crimes, but I want to focus on the one in red, because this is what the American president is referring to: attacks on civilians and civilian objects. Let's look at what these actually are. This includes targeting civilians directly, attacking non-military infrastructure, disproportionate attacks causing excessive civilian harm. Now, this is not the first time that the American president has actually threatened these war crimes very specifically. Let's look at his recent posts. On March 22nd, he said, the US will hit and obliterate their various power plants, starting with the biggest ones first. Then later again, on March 30th, he says, we will conclude our lovely stay in Iran by blowing up and completely obliterating all of the electric generating plants, oil wells and Kharg Island, and possibly all desalination plants. This wasn't enough. Again, 1st of April, we are blasting Iran into oblivion, or, as they say, back to the Stone Age. And then again, on April 4th, 48 hours before, all hell will rain down on them. And then finally, the big, most dangerous threat. Tuesday will be Power Plant Day and Bridges Day. So these are direct threats from the American president, which, as we said very clearly, constitute war crimes. Now, let's take a look at the civilian casualties during this war. And if you look at this graph, this tells a story of tragedy and law of the jungle. In Iran, so far, according to official figures, 2,076 people have been killed. In Lebanon, 1,461. These form the bulk of the civilian casualties, and the countries responsible for them are the United States and Israel. The others, you can see how minimal they are. Now, based on all of this, if we look at the civilian casualties in Gaza, because when we are talking about mass murder, you have to talk about Gaza. And this chart shows you exactly how much. 70,373 innocent civilians murdered by Israel in Gaza, which constitutes genocide. And when we talk of genocide, how can we not talk of this man? If there is anybody who's actually a war criminal in the world, it is this man, Israel's prime minister. In fact, legally speaking, he has been, by the International Criminal Court, he's been charged for war crimes, and his arrests have been issued. The charges are responsible for war crimes of starvation as a method of warfare and of intentionally directing an attack against the civilian population, which constitutes genocide. At this stage, in this conflict, we all hope that the American president realizes that his actions constitute war crime and he desists from them. So with Pakistan's diplomatic initiative going into high gear, there are some very fundamental and foundational questions that are being asked. Foremost of which is, how do we gain from this? Now, the answer may not be too obvious, because when we talk of gains, there are already some visible ones. We've got the kind of high profile role that we have so far is in many ways unprecedented. Pakistan is being toasted everywhere, or if not toasted, at least appreciated, or if not appreciated, at least mentioned as the only country that may help find a way out of this crisis. All that is very good, and we all hope, of course, that ultimately Pakistan's role bears fruit. There is a ceasefire, and this very unfortunate conflict comes to an end. But then there is another aspect which perhaps is not so visible, or a question that is not being asked loudly enough. And that is, what do we get out of it? And in more specific terms, how do we address our economic weaknesses through our diplomatic and military strength? Now, that's a topic that I think needs to be discussed. The time is opportune, and therefore we have two guests today who are perfectly suited to answer some of these not too easy questions. Dr. Abid Suleri, he's the Executive Director of SDPI and one of the most well-known columnists on business and economy in Pakistan. Joining him is Mr. Fahd Hussain, a weekly columnist for Dawn newspaper and Pakistan's foremost commentator on business affairs. And also, what he doesn't let on is that he keeps a very close eye on the geopolitical dimension of this conflict also. So we'll try and see if we can bring that out of him also. Thank you both for joining us. Khurram, let me actually start with you. So let's talk about the fact that our diplomacy is, for the lack of a better word, on steroids. Where could this lead us in terms of addressing the fundamental weaknesses that we suffer from in Pakistan?
Fahd, thanks for the invitation and thanks for that very generous introduction as well. I can see three possible ways that we can tally up the benefits for Pakistan. One of those ways is and the biggest one is the obvious one. The end of a war, a potentially ruinous war on our own border is something. I don't see a bigger payoff for Pakistan than that, frankly speaking. This war is bad news for everybody, but especially for Iran's immediate neighbors, and that includes us. So I think just that by itself is payoff enough for Pakistan, and it's probably the single biggest one. But secondly, in our own history, we see at least one other occasion in the past where Pakistan played an outsized role as by serving as a bridge between great powers, not to end a hot war necessarily, but to help bring about a realignment in the superpowers global geopolitics. And that was in the late 60s and the early 70s when Pakistan worked with the Nixon administration to help bring about the policy of to help implement the policy of détente, and which led to the official recognition of China by the United States. Now, Pakistan played a very central, very important role in that, and that was probably the high point of Pakistan's diplomacy and foreign policy. The third major benefit we could perhaps tally up in dollars and cents, because Pakistan would emerge as a very important provider of security, both diplomatic as well as physical security, to the Middle East. Because after this war, it's fairly clear that the United States will play a very diminished role in the Middle East. This is probably their last dying gas, for a history that has seen endless interventions in the Middle East. This is probably the last of them. And after this, countries like Egypt, Turkey, and Pakistan that have large militaries in the region or bordering the region are going to play an outsized role. Exactly what that role will be, I don't know. But that will be another benefit for Pakistan.
But in that sense, okay, Dr. Abid Suleri, I agree with Khurram that, of course, it's important to have goodwill, and the example that he gave of China, we've enjoyed that goodwill and we've translated it into not only diplomatic support, but also military support, and in many ways, economic support also. CPEC is just the latest example of, the relationship with China that has benefited us. But if I were to put it a little less directly, diplomatic and military support is very good. But right now, we are witnessing the effects of our economic weakness. I mean, because of the way that we've maneuvered our diplomacy and as a direct result of our thrashing of India last year, we are in many ways, and I believe that, we are punching above our weight. And that's because if our economic weakness was not so acute and dependent on other people, we would be, probably at a much higher level in terms of the impact that we are having right now. So we all agree on the economic weakness. Now, a lot of it is dependent on outside factors, but most of it is dependent on the actions of our governments repeatedly. This moment we have, it is here today, it might not be tomorrow. Is there any way that we could actually monetize the benefits of our good diplomacy and our good military performance?
Well, thank you very much, Fahd, for raising this very pertinent question. And I think this geopolitics is already providing some geoeconomic dividends. To begin with, unless and until we had this agreement with Saudi Arabia, a pact with Saudi Arabia, the Mutual Defense Pact, we were bargaining for extension of rollovers on a quarterly basis, and now those deposits, they are here for 1 whole year. We don't have to actually bargain it after every 2 months, try to keep those deposits with us. Likewise, this oil on deferred payment again from Kingdom, that cannot take place without politics turning into geoeconomy. Even the staff level agreement with the IMF, we know that during the war, IMF mission, they left country with inconclusive talks. But then one is mindful of the fact that within IMF shareholding, United States with its 16% share has a larger say, and I can easily read that this smooth passing of this staff level agreement between Pakistan and IMF staff, that was part of recognition of Pakistan's diplomatic effort for peace. Even 2 days ago, when Prime Minister reduced petroleum development levy and gave this relief to people of Pakistan, and IMF so far hasn't made any statement opposing this move, irrespective of the fact whether they are comfortable or not comfortable with this initiative, or from where the last revenue would be compensated. That again tells you that this geopolitics is slowly but steadily is converging into geoeconomy. And finally, the ease with which Pakistan will be able to return the UAE's $2 billion that they deposited in our central bank. Pakistan would have those some standby arrangements with other friendly nations, which will not affect its net international foreign reserves. Otherwise, returning those $2 billion and then another $1 billion on Eurobond payment in April, it could have drastically affected our net international reserve target that we have negotiated with the IMF. But Pakistan is quite comfortable. You can see that there is absolutely no panic in Ministry of Finance, and we are very comfortable in returning that payment. So all of this, although it may not be very visible, but they are the clear signs that Pakistan's diplomatic efforts, Pakistan's geopolitical efforts in being part of solution, they are somehow turning into geoeconomy as well.
Khurram, then linked to this, of course, is the other factor which I want to put in front of you. You know, we've always talked about the cost of war, and that wars are very expensive to fight. And this time, in this particular war, we're actually putting a figure to how expensive it is. We're hearing that for the US, it's costing about $1 billion a day, which means that they've spent about $40 billion in about as many days. Now, obviously, we've got our own security concerns, you know, with Afghanistan, with our war against these terror organizations, and of course, the unresolved issue with our eastern neighbor. So we are in a conflict zone. And now we also know that we need to have deep pockets to ensure that we fight well. So is that a lesson that you think we will learn? And if that be so, then making sure that we have enough resources to fight the fights that we may need to fight. Is that a red flag, or is that an opportunity which we can now try and leverage with our current strong diplomatic position?
Fahad, our enduring economic problems are our own to solve, first and foremost. So looking for external geopolitical rents through which to solve or through which to bridge the deficits that arise from our own economic dysfunction is how we've been doing things all along. And that is how we have come to a point today where something like almost half of our gross external reserves consist of bilateral assistance of some sort provided by friendly countries. And that obviously then provides them with all kinds of leverage over Pakistan as well. And that's not a situation that we should relish being in or seek to deepen in any way. So, and of course, these economic weaknesses impact our ability, or Pakistan's ability, to fight a prolonged war or extend hostilities beyond very limited horizons, because there's only so much foreign exchange reserves, there's only so much fuel stocks, and the cost of replacement of material is also very high. So, I think looking at what's happening in Iran right now, looking at the protracted nature of the conflict Pakistan may be facing with Afghanistan, low intensity conflict, nowhere near the kind of kinetic tempo that Iran is obviously facing. There's no comparison. But at a low intensity level, the fact that a problem is there to stay from Afghanistan for Pakistan should be a bit of a wake-up call that without strong economic foundations, you're not really going to be able to afford the security burdens that are coming our way.
Dr. Abid Suleri, wake-up call, Khurram says it's and then most of the problems that we face economically are a direct result of our internal dysfunctions. We've been hearing this for the last 70 years, and this is not the first wake-up call, but somehow we refuse to wake up. And even now, when we're looking at how things are done, this business as usual approach, where we know what reforms need to be taken, we know what difficult decisions need to be taken, we know how the economy needs to be set on the right tracks. We know all of those things, but somehow we can't get them done because of either lack of political will or lack of economic will. Now, this has been a sad story. With this opportunity in front of us, this moment upon us, and Pakistan playing a very good role, is there anything to suggest to you that we may actually be waking up to this wake-up call and may now those things that we should have done before to fix our economy?
Thank you. I completely endorse Khurram's point of view. And I'd just like to add, only today, STPI, we released a report on impact of war on economy. So our forecast based on models and the scenarios of crude prices are that the GDP growth may be reduced by at least 1%. We are expecting the inflation to be in this 2025-2026 until 30th of June to be around 7.5 to 8%, and then perhaps in double figures next fiscal year. And of course, that would also impact the interest rate or the monetary policy as well. The taxation, one has to see either this increase in this indirect taxation to compensate for the subsidies and for the petroleum development levy that is now has been stopped, or there would be a very serious cut on expenditure. So all of these are wake-up calls. Now, I think going forward, what needs to be done is to be more transparent with the people of Pakistan and be honest with ourselves. Of course, as being pragmatic practitioner, some of the geoeconomic advantages of geopolitics and the diplomacy that we discussed in your previous question, those are very much there. But then, of course, bringing the house in order is absolutely important. If, for example, we are looking at the opportunity that our exporters or investors, they would bring their dollars back from Middle East to Pakistan. In order to do it, State Bank would have to ease the regulation whereby the Pakistanis or others, they can bring their legitimate foreign currency in Pakistan and they can take out their tax paid foreign currency with as much ease as possible, so that people, they don't have to put their, or the exporters, they don't have to put their money in safe havens like Middle East. Talking of opportunities, another opportunity that I can foresee whenever the war stops is reconstruction opportunities in the Middle East. Middle East is not like the Middle Eastern countries, they are not like Gaza or Lebanon. One hopes that as soon as the war ends, Qatar, UAE, Kuwait, Bahrain, they will go for very high, intensive civil engineering work for infrastructure reconstruction and others, and that's where our blue service providers, blue collar service providers, they will be able to contribute.
Right.
But
So
again, we need to bring our house on order for
that's
it.
a big
And
thing. That is the
yeah,
that is
and
the big if, Can we get our house in order? That is the problem, because we all know that we need to get it done, but we somehow never actually get to it. That is the issue.
Yes, that remains an issue, but I think we can't keep on relying on external. Of course, one statement on social media and all our these stopgap arrangements for balancing our external or current account deficit, it would be all topsy-turvy. So
Khurram Hussain and Dr. Abid Suleri, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your analysis. That's the full frame for tonight. See you tomorrow.